Hello students, it's Mr. Vini talking today about Greek mythology, gods, goddesses, myths, poetry, and fables. Now we're going to start today talking about myths, and it's important to understand that myths are everywhere. You hear the Greek myths, there's many movies made about Greek myths, so we're going to talk a little bit about it, but it's important to understand that a myth is a traditional story about gods and heroes, and they always expressed the religious beliefs of that time. So Greeks believed in many gods and goddesses. They believed that the gods shaped their lives and events, that every aspect of life, everything that happened in your day, happened because of the gods. And that's what the myths were about. So since myths are about gods and goddesses, let's talk about the gods and goddesses. Now it's important to understand that the Greeks believed that their gods and goddesses lived on Mount Olympus. And as I said, they believed in many gods and goddesses, but there were 12 major gods and goddesses. Gods like Hera, Hades, Apollo, Hermes, Poseidon, just to name a few. But the most important, or the chief god, was Zeus. Zeus was considered the father of the gods, right? And there's myths about how Zeus took power and how that came about. But Zeus becomes the chief god. Gods were not all powerful. People seem to think gods are all powerful. They weren't. They actually, the Greeks believed, looked and acted a lot like humans. And so the Greeks wanted to win the favor of the gods. They felt like they needed to have the gods on their side. So they had many rituals and festivals to honor the gods. A couple of them, the Greek theater grew out of honoring the god Dionysus. And also the Olympics were there to honor Zeus. So there's just a couple of the festivals and rituals that they used to honor gods. Now let's talk about oracles, because you couldn't just go and visit the gods. You had to go along and get prophecies and stuff. So let's talk about an oracle. A sacred shrine the Greeks visited to find out about the future, because they always had to know what was happening. They believed in all kinds of different prophecies, different things that were going to happen. So the most famous was the oracle to the god Apollo at the Temple of Delphi. And this gave advice to Greeks using prophecies, as I said. So the Greeks would go to an oracle and they would ask a priest or a priestess that was in there questions, and then the priest or priestess would come back. But they never came back with a yes or no answer. It was a prophecy. It was this is what's going to happen, this is what we think could happen, or this may be what could happen. And they were very vague, and it took then the person to kind of see if they could figure it out. Like one time there was a great warrior, and he went and asked what's going to happen in this battle, and the prophecy was that a great kingdom will fall. Well, he thought that meant he was going to win, when in all actuality he lost, and it was his kingdom that fell. So that's oracles. All right, let's spend a little time talking about Greek poetry and fables. They're some of the oldest stories in the Western world. And Greek poetry was usually in the form of epics. Now, epics were long poems about heroic deeds. And two of the most famous epics were written by a guy named Homer. They were the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad is a poem that was written about the Trojan War. And we're going to talk more about the Trojan War in class, right? It was fought between the city of Troy and the Greeks, and we're going to learn a lot about that later in class, but the Trojan War is what the Iliad's about, and as I said, Homer wrote that. The Odyssey was about Odysseus, who was one of the heroes of the Trojan War, and we'll learn a little more about that also. Now, the Greeks looked at epics as real history. So they looked at Homer as maybe one of the first historians, one of the first history teachers. Even though it was a story about these heroic deeds, they looked at it as real history. They also liked the fact that epics taught courage, honor, and loyalty, some of the characteristics that they felt every Greek person should have, these qualities they were looking for, and epics did a good job of teaching those. Now, fables, on the other hand, were not long stories, they were short tales. And these short tales would teach a lesson. So fables were used to teach Greeks lessons, things that they should learn, right? Aesop is one of the most famous people to write fables. He wrote an awful lot of fables. They usually involved animals that had humanistic qualities. So a lot of times they would point out human flaws and the strengths that humans had. And every fable would end with a message or the moral of the story. So if you've ever heard somebody say, well, the moral of the story is this, that's the lesson that you should pick up from it. And fables were very good at that. Short tales that teach a lesson. One of the most famous ones you've probably heard was The Tortoise and the Hare, where slow and steady wins the race. That's the moral that comes from it. And people, pick up lessons from that. So that's what fables were about. I hope you enjoyed this little discussion. We'll talk more about Greek mythology, gods, goddesses, myths, poetry, and fables in class. Hope you enjoyed this, and I'll talk to you later.